Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Of course, many people have received knocks on their doors, probably you too, from traveling salespeople. Sometimes they're selling services, other times products. Well, the very first ones to do this in the U.S. were the so-called Yankee Peddlers. They were the original traveling salesmen. Well, Kathy Nelson is the librarian emeritus in Berlin, Connecticut, and she studied the Yankee Peddlers because they originated in her town. Two men in particular are widely credited with starting the Yankee Peddler tradition and also the tin industry. Kathy's going to be along with this fascinating story in just a moment. This week's trivia question: how many airports are there in Connecticut with regular commercial service? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. How many times has somebody knocked on your door trying to sell you something? Well, you can thank a Connecticut invention known as the Yankee Peddler for making this form of personal salesmanship a thing. It was around 300 years ago or so that the whole business model of taking something to sell directly to the consumer in their home started in Berlin, Connecticut. Now, by the middle of the 1800s, Yankee Peddlers were a common sight everywhere, not just across the Connecticut countryside, but around the entire country. They brought their wares in increasingly sophisticated fashion. First, they simply were on foot, then they got on a horse, and finally, they had wagons. They brought their products to eager households where they would either sell them for cash or barter for something else of value. Now, these entrepreneurial Connecticut salesmen eventually got to the point where they would set off in the spring, be on the road for months at a time, and return before the next winter set in, flush with cash from making their rounds. Now, Yankee Peddlers really got their start peddling tin products. In fact, quite a long list of such products, as you're going to hear. And in fact, Berlin not only gave us the peddler business model, but it was where the tin industry was born here in the United States. Our guest today has studied the subject thoroughly and has a fascinating story to tell. We welcome back Kathy Nelson, the librarian emeritus of the town of Berlin. You know, Kathy, when I wanted to do an episode on Yankee Peddlers, I reached out to you. You set me straight in saying you can't really talk about Yankee Peddlers without talking about the tin industry in the United States, and I was a little bit curious about that. And then you said, well, you can't talk about the tin industry in the United States without talking about this guy, Edward Patterson, and his younger brother, William. So that's, I guess, where we're going to start. We're going to go back to 1740, and this is when Edward Patterson came to Berlin from Europe, and just pick up the story. What happened?
Edward came with his younger brother William and sister Anna, and they came to central Connecticut, Berlin, and they were there by 1740. Now, Edward came to America supposedly with 18 cents in his pocket, and he brought with him tin sheets, and he soon began pounding the tin into pots and pans. This is entirely a hand operation. He had a small shop adjacent to his house on Lower Lane in town here. He packed them into 2 baskets, slung them from his shoulders, and traveled on foot. Well, soon he had sold to everyone in town, and with his brother, he even sold into New Britain.
Indeed, he did, and in fact, a whole bunch more. Just to go back for a second, Lower Lane, I think there's a great story here. It's essentially, I mean, give or take a mile or two, it's I-91 today, right? So this is what turned out to be one of the major routes from New Haven to Hartford. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Well, it was basically what they called the Hartford-New Haven Path. well before 91 was even thought of, or even the Berlin Turnpike. The problem with Lower Lane was it was lower, so it was muddy. And so eventually they moved the road to Worthington Ridge. And that was originally part of the Berlin Turnpike at the early 1900s when they built that highway.
There's another part I wanted to talk to you about, which was so Edward brought some tin sheets with him originally from England because this is where the tin industry sort of started, and he learned the craft there and he brought it with him to the United States. When he, ran out of the tin sheets that he brought, though, he had to get more from England. And they used to bring them in through two places I wanted you to comment on. One was Boston and how they got it down from Boston during the winter. And the second one, and I did not know this, the busiest ports on the Connecticut River was in Middletown. I did not know this. And so they had an actual spot where this tin could come in.
With Boston, it of course came by ship to Boston, and then either by wagon or if it was wintertime by sleigh, they would bring the sheets of tin to town. In the 1800s, the Connecticut River became major navigational route, and the town of Middletown was the largest port, and they even had a dedicated pier just for Berlin tin, either arriving or outgoing.
Now, Berlin in the day, in 1686, when it was settled, up until Edward got there, was really an agricultural town, wasn't it?
Correct. This was the very first business, other than, the local grist mill, the local sawmill, that kind of thing. But this was the first one to have a territory larger than the town lines.
And to show the kind of impact that this had on Berlin, it was 1740 when Edward arrived, and by the 1820s they had 12 tin shops, 6 tool makers, and importantly, and I think this is where it starts to get into the peddler business, 9 makers of carriages and wagons. And what colors did they paint those wagons, and why?
The wagons were painted brightly colored, yellow and red and whatever, because that way they were more visible as they were traveling down the roads and so on.
And because they carried so much tin, I guess you heard them coming too.
Correct. The banging and so on of the tinware. Correct.
Now, when he first started, right, he's carrying a couple of baskets, I guess, on his shoulders, on some contraption on his shoulders. Then he gets on a horse. Then they get on wagons eventually because they're building turnpikes and canals and all this. And, at first, I guess he was just making pots for cookware, but it greatly expanded, right? Could you tell us about some of those other options that they had that people just loved and ate up?
Pretty much anything you can imagine could be made from tin. Pins, needles, scissors, combs, coat and vest buttons, hardware, pill boxes, stovepipes, spice boxes, flour canisters, shaving soap boxes, trays, tumblers, water dippers, chandeliers, foot stoves. We don't think of those, but the houses would be cold, so they'd have a foot stove for their feet. Lunch pails, coffee pots, lamps, lanterns, all kinds of things.
That's amazing. And they were competing against really pewter, which was pretty dull looking, iron and wood. And for most people, I guess the wealthy could go with copper or brass, but tin made a very great product that sort of slipped right in there.
Well, it was really nice because it was easy to make, easy to pound with a hammer, or later in the 1800s, they'd have tin snips. It was shiny. It looked good. It was easy to cook on. So it was a very popular commodity.
And you said something very important with the tin snips and the tools, right? Because all of this grew up as well in Berlin. It wasn't just the products, right? It was the tools to make them.
Yes. One of the major companies was Jedediah North and his brother Edmund, who formed a company. And this company became like a college of New England tin tool makers. Employees would learn the trade, and then they'd leave and open up their own shops. And when they left, they didn't necessarily just go to the neighboring towns and all. They would travel to Massachusetts and New York and other places.
Another thing I want to pick your mind on here is the concept of this business model of Yankee Peddlers. Now, I had always been under the impression that these are guys who had a wagon, a couple horses, loaded it up to the hilt, rode around as far as the horses could take them, and then that was it. But you bring in a very interesting point in your research is that there were also then turnpikes and canals built, and this greatly expanded the ability to sell these things further. But also the demand side was such that they couldn't make enough of this. And so they kept going further and further and further. If you could just speak to this a little bit, it's fascinating.
That's really where the term Yankee Peddler comes from, actually. It seems that every village and remote hamlet had been visited by tin peddlers. And I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Timothy Dwight, who is president of Yale College, but he wrote a book called Dwight's Travels in New England and New York. And here's a quote for you. Every inhabited part of the United States has been visited by these men, meaning the Yankee traders. I have seen them on the peninsula of Cape Cod and in the neighborhood of Lake Erie, distant from each other more than 600 miles. They make their way to Detroit, 400 miles farther to Canada, to Kentucky, and if I mistake not, to New Orleans and St. Louis.
And when you think about this, what these people were doing was bypassing all the local merchants and just bringing products directly to the consumer, which was, they were finally upended by the Sears and Roebuck catalog. But until then, there was nothing like it, was there?
Correct. Although they would have stations along the way where they could resupply and so on. So they did have some stores. But yes, basically it was in my day, I remember the Fuller Brush salesman going house to house and encyclopedia salespeople going house to house. And that was the basic model of the Yankee Peddler.
The other thing that this did for the tin industry was it made the tin industry sort of the king for 150 years, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because the early pieces are not painted and they're not signed in any way. It's later, and I believe it's the 1850s before they began to really paint them. And so you'd have painted trays and tins and so on. There was quite an operation of women who would paint these items for sale.
Now, one of the things you have to talk about when you're talking about Yankee Peddlers is the reputation that they sometimes had as not always being above board. And one of the reasons for this was what I'll call a legend, because nobody seems to have any proof this actually happened, but I tend to come from the school of where there's smoke, there's fire, or probably fire. And, we're called the Nutmeg State, and there were these wooden nutmegs supposedly carved by Yankee Peddlers from Connecticut that would be mixed in with real nutmegs, and they look similar enough, and they'd sell them for a huge profit compared to regular nutmegs. What do you know about all this?
Yes. Actually, the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a reference book not only of words, but also phrases and the first usage of things. The first earliest reference to a wooden nutmeg was in 1820, and the meaning was anything false or fraudulent. But apparently there was a Canadian author who wrote humorous and satirical commentary about colonial life. He had a character named Sam Slick, and his books were wildly popular. And he was the one who was the first to have printed that New England peddlers warranted broken watches as the best timekeepers in the world. They would sell trinkets for gold and always have a large assortment of wooden nutmegs. And interesting enough, apparently this became an issue in the whole North versus the South tensions leading up to the Civil War, that the Yankee Peddler was not to be trusted. In some ways, it reminds me of the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, which at the time was a British put down of Americans. And now it's our Connecticut state song, and it's a song of patriotism. And so we embrace this negative image and find the positive in it. So we are the nutmeg state.
When you talk about the whole idea of what sort of killed off the Yankee Peddler, because all good things have to come to an end, and the Yankee Peddler movement did too, although we had door-to-door salespeople not too long ago. But really, I guess after the Civil War, and this tends to happen with technologies, tin lost favor to enamel and porcelain. Do I have that right?
Correct. After the Civil War, porcelain and enameled cooking vessels were very popular, and then tinware kind of ebbs from popularity of usage. But for 150 years, tinware was the number one item carried by the Yankee Peddler.
Two powerful forces combined to knock the Yankee Peddler out of business: the Industrial Revolution and the coming of the railroads. And yes, the Sears and Roebuck catalog ended up substituting for a live peddler, and with all those products being mass-produced and being able to be moved by rail, well, it simply rang the death knell for the legendary Yankee Peddler. That wraps up this edition of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, Yankee Peddlers really brought a new concept to the young United States, a concept that's not only continued to the present day but has thrived, and that is the concept of the consumer supporting the broader economy. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Kathy Nelson, Librarian Emeritus in Berlin, Connecticut. The answer to this week's trivia question simply was, how many airports are there in Connecticut with regular commercial service? And the answer is 2. Bradley International Airport in Windsor Locks and Tweed, New Haven, which straddles both New Haven and East Haven. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to take a look at the history of the smaller and lesser known of the two, Tweed, New Haven, an airport that actually has been around longer than Bradley, and whose namesake, Jack Tweed, is an amazing story all by himself. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.